Welcome to another edition of the Business Career College Continuing Education course series offered through our online portals, our online service. The title of this presentation is The Role of the Executor. It's about dealing with issues surrounding the death of a client or advice one's giving, and perhaps dealing with claims when death of a client occurs. As always with courses that we teach or segments that we offer that might delve into the area of providing legal advice, we must have a disclaimer that says this is not to be considered or construed as legal advice. Please consult with a legal professional to better assess your situation or any situation that you may encounter. The purpose of developing such a course as this for insurance professionals pertains to the role of the executors to deal with the issues that arise when a death occurs with one of your clients, and how an insurance advisor might guide a client as to best and most effective methods for proper estate settlement. What is an executor? A person who creates a will designed to provide instructions to how their wealth will be dispersed upon their death will obviously have to ensure that their wishes get carried out. In other words, appoint someone to execute their wishes. The testator, testatrix if it's a female, is the person who actually creates the will. They appoint an executor, male, or executrix, female, to carry out their wishes. You're not around to do it, so somebody has to do it for you. Some general comments. In my experience over the years of encountering people who have performed the role of the executor, I know in our typical continuing education course offerings where we do live seminars, and periodically we'll bring a lawyer in to talk about executor duties and estate settlement issues, and we ask the question, who has ever performed the role of the executor? The next question then becomes, would you do it again if you were asked? And a lot of people say, no, never, would not wish that on my worst enemy. It can be a frustrating process. Could be challenging, time-consuming, and very frustrating at times. As an executor, you take on the role of trustee of the estate, with responsibility to manage the estate assets in a prudent manner. You'll notice if you follow legal cases today and what goes on in the area of court decisions, there's much emphasis put on the role and duties of trustees. The executor is actually a trustee of the estate created when someone dies. Their responsibility is to manage and look after that in a very prudent manner. And prudent could perhaps be described as the wise middle road. General duties. Now, the slide here says there's 3. There's actually 4. But generally we'd say your role is to gather up the assets of the deceased, track down and pay the creditors of the deceased, and distribute the residue to the intended beneficiaries. The 4th role might be to locate the will, although I will cover that on a future slide. When death occurs, what happens? Well, the first thing that has to be done is to arrange for the disposal of the body. You can't stuff the body in the freezer and keep it cold until you can afford to arrange a burial. There's legal requirements for notifying the proper authorities and then to arrange for the disposal of the body. Typically that is done though by a registered funeral director. One of their duties is to confirm that the person is deceased and identify that person. So even though we include this in the role of the executor, it's done by someone else, but the executor is making sure along the way that all of these things are done. So the executor might, for a lot of the issues arising around uh, the death of a person for whom they've been appointed as executor in the will, might be just the quarterback in some scenarios, making sure things get done, uh, perhaps a checkbox of saying what has to be done, who's doing it. The body can be buried or cremated or shipped to a foreign country. Uh, Being the fact that Canada is a significant immigrant, has huge immigrant population, many people want their loved ones shipped back to a home country, India, China, the Philippines, South America, someplace else to be disposed of, to be buried. There's no backyard burials allowed, nor are there burials allowed on property that's not having registered cemetery status. So I grew up watching John Wayne westerns, and he'd stand on the back porch of the log cabin in his huge ranch and look out over the horizon and see the old oak tree with the little cross and say, that's where Pa is buried. Well, unless that space has registered cemetery status, that can't be done today. That's just a myth or a fiction. Information needed. So one of the things that an executor does is takes on the role of gathering up a lot of information. You take a significant amount of responsibility, which starts with the gathering of pertinent information. We call it the first thing we look at is our vital statistics, gathered by the executor and provided to the funeral director. Now, if you go to a funeral home and find out what they do, they have systems in place and forms to fill out, and they do a fairly decent job of gathering up the information that's required. For instance, the full legal name of the deceased. Now, we have a concern today because of the huge immigrant population we have, where people come to Canada and are assigned a name different than what they were given when they were born back in China or India or wherever else, and they anglicize or Canadianize the name. That's sometimes done by their choice. I've been told over the years that sometimes immigration, depends who you get, just automatically gives somebody a name that is close but may not be their legal name. So we have to identify who the person is. We want your home address and phone numbers, any contact information. How many years have you lived in Canada? If you're an immigrant, your occupation and title, the industry that you're in, the type of business that you were performing, the profession that it was in. If you're a professional, we want to know that. Business address and phone numbers, social insurance number, and if a person is a veteran of the Canadian military or the military of another nation, then we want to identify that person through any kind of registration number they might have with that organization that they served. Vital statistics continued, more. There's lots to gather. We want to know the date and place of birth. Citizenship. Of what country or countries are you a citizen? Your father's name, your father's birthplace, the mother's maiden name, the mother's birthplace, religious names, religious affiliations, your marital status, and if it's a male and has a spouse, then we need to know the maiden name of the wife or of the spouse. If there's been a name change when someone got married, I see it's not uncommon today to see the husband taking on the wife's name instead of a traditional way of the wife taking on the husband's name. So if that's the case, one would have to identify who that person was when they started out in life and what their maiden name would have been. The names of the children, the names of any siblings. Now we need to make some funeral arrangements, actual arrangements for disposal of the body. A lot of people today don't want a formal funeral. They want something a little less formal, a little less official. But the question is, will it be a burial or a cremation? Now, one of the things you have to do is deal with many different organizations, and all of them want proof that the person that you're making changes for or accessing funds on behalf of is actually a deceased, so they want a copy of the funeral director's certificate, death certificate, something to prove that the person's dead, and they want an original. So you might advise your clients who are dealing with the funeral home, or if you're the executor doing these things yourself, is to obtain enough copies of the death certificate to satisfy all the requirements. Anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 might be appropriate, depends on the circumstances of how complex the person's situation was. Now, if we're going to have a burial or a viewing of the body that's going to take place sometime later, more than a few days in the future, then we have to make sure the body is properly preserved, and that's a process called embalming. So we have to get the body prepared and for the embalming process and make sure it's done if the circumstances warrant. Now, the person could have been in a car accident or some tragic accident that brought about the death, and we might want to do some work on the person's face to do some plastic surgery or restore the face to its state that we want to remember it by. So we do some restorative art, cosmetology, apply some makeup, and maybe do the hair up. We want to look at this person and remember them how we knew them while they were alive. Common in most burial arrangements, funerals or funeral celebrations or whatever you want to call it, to have flowers. It's a common thing today, so one's got to make sure the flowers are appropriate. Florists are supposed to know what's appropriate for a funeral. I remember I was traveling one time, and it was an anniversary, I think, and or a birthday. I sent some flowers to my wife's where she was working at the time. It happened to be in our own business, and so these flowers showed up, and one of our staff members said to Penny, to my wife, "Oh, who died?" The flower shop had actually put together a bouquet of funeral flowers. They kind of, I've never lived that down. That's about 20 years ago, or perhaps only a decade ago, but I'm still getting reminded of that periodically. We want to prepare the necessary papers, obtain any legal certificates and permits, and make sure everything is done properly. More funeral arrangements. Will there be a memorial record book? Perhaps somebody can, when people come, they sign their name and who it was and where they're from, and that's important for some families. It's some people take this rather seriously and want to know. They want to be able to look back and remember who was there, who showed up at their husband's funeral, their wife's funeral, or grandpa's funeral, or whatever, and who was there, and any notes that these people put in, any acknowledgments. Will we have acknowledgement cards? So I remember in the old days, growing up in a little town in Saskatchewan, when somebody died, you would go to the local grocery store and the restaurants and the gas bars, and you would see these acknowledgement cards, announcement cards they were called, on the counter that says so-and-so died and the funeral will be here. So do we want that? Will we be doing that? Or when you go to the funeral celebration itself, you walk in the door and the ushers are handing out this little cards that tell you the story of who it was that died. Now, we could have a service folder that includes everything in it in one package. Will we put photographs in the folders so we can remember somebody? Basically, so it's one of the things you'll do as the executor is you might arrange family meetings and make sure that they pick the favorite picture of the deceased person to use. We want to remember somebody fondly. Will there be an obituary, and who's going to write it? Now, the newspapers do have people who write obituaries, but it's quite often better perhaps to have somebody that is familiar with the family dynamics and somebody in the family, and there's a cost involved And you don't want to get caught by surprise. When my father died, I thought it was appropriate, because I was living in Edmonton at the time, and appropriate that there should be an obituary placed in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, where my mom and dad lived when dad died, and thought I would put one in the Edmonton Journal, where uh, myself and my brother were living at the time, and one back in our community newspaper in our little hometown of Saskatchewan, where we had lived for many years. My father was in business, and I thought it was appropriate that people should be uh, notified of Dad's death. And then I got the bill, and it was quite a shock as to how much it costs now to put those obituaries in the newspapers, or death notices as they might be described as in some circles. But it's an obituary. It's just really the story of somebody's life in print, who their survivors are, uh, when they were born, when they died, and where the arrangements are going to be, the funeral or memorial service will be held, and if appropriate, where any donations can be made. Then we have to deal with filling out any insurance forms and any government forms. We might arrange for a funeral coach. Um, I was at a funeral in Edmonton in January. A longtime friend and mentor in the financial service industry died, and the funeral service was in a church just out of downtown Edmonton, and this interment, the burial was taking place at a cemetery about an hour out of town. So the funeral homes, uh, funeral services would have these coaches. It's luxurious bus that would transport people out there and back to avoid having to deal with traffic and these long, uh, dragged out funeral processions that are causing all kinds of frustration. So that's not uncommon today to see that. And then, of course, there's the family. How do they get about? They don't want to have to worry about getting there on time or getting caught in traffic or not finding parking at their own loved one's funeral. So we might arrange for the limousine uh, provided by the funeral home as part of their service, or hired by someone who's looking after affairs, the executor perhaps, or a family member, to pick the family up at their home and take them to the church or the location for the service, whatever structure that's taking, and then perhaps take them out to the burial site if that's what's happening, and take them back. It takes a lot of stress off. Fairly tough times here. We don't want to be caught up with worrying about the mundane. So these are little situations that have to be done. Whether you do it or not, it needs to be considered and looked at as some of the things little details that are pop up when somebody dies. Now, the funeral itself, will there be a visitation? You'll see many funerals, many families wish an opportunity for loved ones, relatives, neighbors, friends, workmates, former workmates to come and visit with the family, and might do it the evening before the funeral, call it a visitation. It might be at the funeral home, might be at the church, might be at a hall, might be at a home. So have a visitation, and then if it's going to be a burial or even a cremation, before we cremate the body or bury it, we might want to have a viewing of the body. So will that be at an open or closed casket? So sometimes people want that open casket because it gives them a sense of closure. So a lot of older people, more mature people, need that sense of closure, and they're somewhat insulted if somebody's buried and they get a chance to walk by the casket and view the person in their current state. Will there be religious service, prayers involved, and if so, what are the prayers that we're going to recite? Will it be a church service, a memorial service? And what's the structure? What's the format? What's the outline? What will be the readings and the musical selections? And so you'll probably see Amazing Grace played at many funerals. It's one of the funerals of the songs of choice, but you're starting to see some newer uh, songs be used in the process, or somebody's favorite music. Mine might be a few songs from Johnny Cash, but my family might have other thoughts about that. Will there be an organist? Maybe some family member or friend who's skilled at playing the organ in public and could come and add some live music to the process. A soloist, somebody who can sing well in this environment. Sometimes one of the most moving parts of the funeral celebration is when the soloist goes up and you sometimes hear the best singers you'll ever hear. Will there be a choir? A little less commonplace today, but it depends on the circumstances around the person who's deceased. Now, who will be the celebrant? Will it be the priest, the minister from his uh, religious environment, or will it be a family member or a friend? Or I've had the privilege over the years of being asked to be the celebrant at more than a few funeral celebrations or celebrations of life, as people like to call them. And so it was very important for me to learn the process and to follow it properly and to present it in a manner that left the people feeling good about the loved one that they're saying goodbye to. Now, when we're using the funeral home or the facilities provided, typically, as I mentioned, the one I went to in earlier this year in Edmonton was just outside of downtown in a fairly large church, but not a lot of parking around. So I had to make sure that there were permits for parking provided and signage, and perhaps the funeral home would put out parking signs reserved for funeral and scattered all over the place. It's cold, winter day, you got to walk a long uh, distance to get there. Might be uncomfortable for some people. I went to a funeral a couple of years ago in Napa Valley, just north of San Francisco. A friend of mine died, a rather tragic motorcycle accident, and it happened that he was an addictions counselor and worked in a facility uh, in California that had the contract for providing addiction services to dentists and doctors who were recovering from their various addictions, and he was revered in that area. And so I went there, and the parking arrangements, the parking directors were the dentists and doctors who were in recovery in this man's treatment facility. So you got to pay attention to that stuff. Who's going to look after this? You don't want people showing up frustrated and can't find parking and miss the ceremony because of that. So the idea here is to make people feel comfortable. Now, what casket will we be using? Will we accept one of the ones that the funeral home has, and there's quite a range. So one of the things they do is they sit down and say, what would you like? And they show you a catalog and might even have a showroom with the caskets in. And the tendency, quite frankly, is to overspend because people are fraught with emotions and they think it's not proper to be concerned about money. So they'll spend whatever, and a lot of people overspend on these parts of the process. The funeral, we want the best looking one possible. Now, if it's going to be cremation, then of course, back to the casket, it is possible for people to buy their own casket from someplace other than the funeral home. Costco, if you're a Costco or card holder and shopper, if you check on their their website and go online, you can actually find the caskets you can order from Costco. Now, what the funeral home will tell you, if you're going to buy the casket from someplace else, you have to arrange for somebody to be there when it's delivered to accept delivery, so make sure it shows up in an undamaged state and be responsible for the accepting it when there any payment for shipping or whatever must be handled by a family member. Now, if it's going to be cremation, then the body will be placed in a cremation container, and you've got to make those arrangements. And then what about the ashes, the remains that are left over after cremation takes place? So the ashes will be placed in an urn or in some other acceptable container for the body, for the family to take the ashes away. I always think about the urn. I think about the scene from the movie Meet the Fockers, where the guy was standing by the fireplace and had docked the granny's ashes off the mantelpiece into the cat litter. And one of the most hilarious movie scenes that I could ever recall. Now, what are we going to do with the ashes? Are we going to take them home and put them on the mantelpiece, or put them away in a box someplace, or whatever? So some people have real definite ideas about what to do with the ashes. When my mother-in-law died, she had said she wanted her ashes spread over a wheat field in Saskatchewan, because she was raised in Saskatchewan, born on a farm, and lived in Saskatchewan for most of her life. And the wheat fields, the flowing wheat fields, the waves and waves of the yellow wheat in the fall was something that always gladdened her heart. And so she wanted that as part of her remains or celebration. So before you do this, you got to say where, when, and what will be the legalities. I was recently made aware of a situation where the father died, and the sons, who are all adults now, made arrangements to gather in St. John's, Newfoundland, where they rented a boat and took the dad's ashes out onto the Atlantic Ocean and spread them, because Dad had been in his youth a merchant seaman for a while, and he always wanted to go back to the sea. So there was his opportunity. Got to make some decisions about the jewelry and the glasses, if that's appropriate. So maybe the wedding ring would you bury grandma with the wedding ring, or mom, or would you take that off and keep it to give to some other family member to use in their own life or pass on to their children? So those are decisions that must be made, and questions have to be asked. What clothing will we dress the deceased in? So people have their favorite suit. They say, I want to be buried in that suit. Or maybe sometimes the family goes and buys a new suit to bury the loved one in, or a new dress, something to make them look good, perhaps. Will there be a graveside service? This is not as common today as it used to be, because you don't see a lot of cemeteries anymore, and cemetery land is hard to come by. You notice in some of the cities are actually having to make arrangements to move cemeteries now, or there's limited space. So will there be a graveside service? A lot of people don't bother with that anymore. Cremations are more commonplace today than they used to be in the past. Depends on the religion, the culture, and the wishes of the person deceased. More funeral arrangements, photo memories. So I've been to many funerals where they do the PowerPoint slideshow, where they tell the story of somebody's life, sometimes to music, sometimes to narration. Sometimes, you learn something about somebody you never knew, a history of their life. I always find that quite valuable. Now, you don't want a 2-hour movie. It's a 10 or 12-minute slideshow presentation. Doesn't cause people to get antsy or bored or fall asleep. So one of the things they have to pay attention to that. And sometimes the families have to be kind of reminded of the concerns for other people that will be there. So any donations required, we typically don't collect donations to pay for the funeral. The donations might be, Grandpa died of cancer and we want to leave some money to the Cancer Society or the Heart and Stroke Foundation, or maybe the alma mater of a professional who graduated from a university, or something. We want to make sure we pay attention to where the donation should go, and make sure people properly know how to handle the making of the donations, so that the person who's deceased, recognition is given. They know that this is here because Bob Watt died. So that's me, by the way. So I didn't die, but you don't just send money to the Cancer Society in memory of. Will there be a reception? What will be the location? Properly communicated to anybody that might want to attend the ceremony or the service or whatever we're doing. Will we be serving food? And how many people can we expect at the reception? Will it be private or public? One of the jokes is that some of the best egg salad sandwiches you can ever find are at the reception at the after following a typical funeral, especially in small town Western Canada. Now, if we're going to have utilizing a cemetery and leaving the body in a cemetery, will it be in a plot? Many people today are buying the plot ahead of time, and quite often they'll buy a plot and maybe the family plot. So there'll be arrangements for mom and dad to be buried side by side. And I know my brother died when he was a young man at age 18 in a car accident, and I went out and visited the cemetery last summer, and my grandmother and grandfather are buried in that same location. My great grandparents are buried there in that same location, and a couple of other relatives, and my brother and my mother and father were buried in Saskatoon, so they're not there. But you'll see people have these definite ideas, and the problem is that maybe they did this stuff when they lived back in Nova Scotia, and now they're living in Alberta, and so it could be awkward sometimes. One of the things you might have those discussions with your clients: what do you do when, or what are people supposed to do, or what are your expectations? And have you communicated that or put that in writing? So I think a huge service we provide as financial service professionals is helping people make these decisions. There are specialists in this area now who do pre-needs planning and market insurance policies to pay for the funeral and to perhaps help people make these choices and put everything in proper order. And now if there's cremation and nobody wants to take the ashes home in the urn, maybe we're going to place the ashes, the urn, in a niche in the columbarium. Depends on the services you're using. Will the burial vault? Now, if there's a burial cemetery, putting the body in a casket, many of the cemeteries require, because of the way the ground shifts and settles, the casket to be placed in a burial vault, a cement or metal structure that surrounds the casket. It prevents for the sinking of the soil around the casket. You don't want to walk along through the cemetery and see this exposed casket because the ground is settled. So some cemeteries require that and will not allow you to bury somebody there without that burial vault. Will there be a memorial marker? And what will be the inscription on that marker? So you can't really tell the life story. Keep it simple. Beware of the costs. Beware of the potential upkeep and how it will last and stand the test of time and the weathering. And it's kind of nice to see it sometimes, when you go and visit the cemeteries to pay respects for a long deceased loved one. You want to be able to find them easily and have some fond memories. And so that'll be the inscription will say who they are, when they were born, when they died, but not too many other details. We'll handle those in other arrangements. Other decisions and arrangements to be made are notify family and friends, and how will this be handled? Will there be a eulogy? Who will be the eulogist? And what readings will be required for the service? For people with some kind of religious affiliation or background, they'll have their favorite readings. If it's a Catholic ceremony, readings from the gospel, and others just from biblical quotes or readings. Their favorite poem, perhaps, if they're military, maybe a reading from Robert Service or something like that, well-known poems about military experience. And now the eulogist has a huge responsibility, and so somebody must do it. And it's really a short story of the person's life, acknowledging the people that are left to grieve, and a little bit about the person who's deceased, so the people in the congregation or the audience are getting a sense of what the person's life was like. And so as a eulogist, I've done that a few times in my life. I would always find an opportunity to sit with a family and have a meeting and have them share with me some of their favorite memories or stories, and if possible, include that reference in the 15 or 20 minute, probably 12 to 15 minute eulogy that one would be presenting. Again, it's just like your slideshows. You don't want to make it a long, drawn out affair, and you could probably tell when you're sitting there and talking, when the people get restless, you're probably time to stop and move on. Practice is important. I did that, tried it out before I got there and did it. Will there be a funeral or memorial service? Those are decisions to make. Will there be pallbearers? And pallbearers are traditionally those people who are going to carry the casket from the hearse into the location where the funeral or memorial service is being held and back out again. And then perhaps if a graveside of a burial in a cemetery is required, to carry the casket from the hearse again to the gravesite, to the grave, to set it down. And so you want active pallbearers, but sometimes, might be an old judge or lawyer or somebody who is well respected in the community who's deceased, and you might see these honorary pallbearers, people who perhaps aren't in space to be carrying a heavy casket anymore. And so you have active and honorary pallbearers. Those decisions must be made. Who's it going to be, and how will they be contacted? Who's going to do so? What clothing do we wear for the service? Is it going to be formal dress or casual or whatever? Transportation for the family, we dealt with that earlier. The funeral coach or the limousine. Condolences. How do people get a chance to offer condolences? And will they be able to stop by the home? Whatever. You probably see a lot of friends and family will start the minute they hear somebody is deceased, dropping food and flowers off at the home. How do we deal with that? How do people get a chance to show their respects? Well, of course, for anybody that contributes to the process, who's going to handle sending out the thank you cards to acknowledge their services, their efforts? Now, when you have the choir, the soloist, the organist, the celebrant, typically those people expect to get remunerated for their time and effort. So who will look after that? What's the proper amount to pay? You don't give somebody a couple $100s to be the celebrant. It might be typically $20 or whatever. Who looks after that? How does it get done? And we just can't go by and say, well, just ignore it. It's something somebody has to pay attention to it. So now we get into the paperwork. Find the will, and then arrange a meetings with a lawyer. Now, the reason we need a lawyer is the will must be presented to the probate courts for validation. And we go through this process of probate. It comes at a cost. The executor is the one that's going to make sure that those costs are being covered. Then you start looking at the assets. A properly done will lists many things that the person owns and what's supposed to be done. So gather the assets, locate bank accounts, investment accounts, credit cards, insurance policies, cancel all and any pensions that the person was entitled to, apply for the CPP, death benefit, or survivor pension as required, as applicable. Make sure those are done. Now, what we realize, though, is the funeral directors in today's environment have administrative services available, that they do many of these things on behalf of the people that are using their services. Not everybody does, uh, but they do it. So the executor's role is maybe not to do this, but to make sure it's properly done. Notify Canada Revenue Agency, the CRA, notify your provincial health provider, communicate with the employer for any employee benefits, death benefits, and you probably learned somewhere else in other CE courses that we offer that there is a tax-free benefit that an employer can pay up to $10,000, I believe is the current amount, on behalf of a death benefit for a deceased employee, and use that as a tax deduction. Some employers build that in as a tax strategy. It's allowed, so one would know that as an insurance professional. Now you have to deal with land titles because they owned a cottage, they owned a condo, they owned a house, jointly with mom and dad, both names on the title. Now dad's dead, his name has to be taken off, but the land titles office wants proof that dad died. So that funeral director certificate or that death certificate is going to be the proof. Same thing with vehicles. Mom and dad have vehicles. It was in his name. It's now hers because he's dead. So she has to change the ownership on the vehicle through the vehicle's registration office. They want a copy of the death certificate as well. Utilities dealing with the phone company, the gas company, the electric company, they won't deal with you unless, because the account might be in my name, and my wife phones and says, well, my husband died. Well, we want proof of that. We can't give you any information without proof, and you have the right to get this information. We got to locate any marriage certificates where applicable, satisfy any creditors, and then when everything is done, distribute the residue to the beneficiaries of the estate. Deal with life insurance proceeds. Now, the reality here is that the insurance professionals should be doing this. And part of being an insurance professional and running a professional practice is to provide the services necessary to allow for beneficiaries to make a claim against any insurance policies. Failing the fact that there might be an active insurance professional available, the executor would be the one that would make sure that this vital role or function is carried out. This would be for individual policies. There are services out there today where people could pay for this while they're alive, where they will write to every insurance company in Canada and notify that somebody being dying, and see if that company has any policies on this person. I guess that's a valuable service. Might have some value to it, I'm not sure, but it comes at a cost, of course. But you got to consider the stress that people are in when this unexpected event happens. Who's going to carry out all these things? Who's going to do it? And we want to kind of allow this to move on. We ought to be embroiled in a lot of stress here. So sometimes it's good to use those services. Is there group insurance? Again, we dealt with that. We dealt with the employer and any segregated funds, which are typically a life insurance investment product that allows for the naming of beneficiaries. So it's considered to be dealt the same way as life insurance proceeds, normal life insurance policies. Ideally, these services are handled by the agent, but what if that agent is from company A and some of the policies are with company B? Well, that agent might go to a friend who works at company B and ask for their help, or perhaps contact company B and say, listen, I'm the agent for this person who died. They have some insurance with you. Can you send me the forms I need to do a proper help the beneficiary with making appropriate claims? Other important issues to pay attention to are the timelines. Now, there's no definite time in which an estate must be settled and the executor must complete their duties. Sometimes, for a simple process, it could take a few months, less than a year, but could take as long as 2 years or more, depending on the complexity of the estate. I did hear a story one time from one of our lawyer presenters in our live CE courses that their firm had worked on a case where The guy died in central Alberta back in the 30s, and now it was about 2003, and finally the estate was settled, and everything was done, and it's over with now. Everything's been disposed of, but all the wealth would have been uh, probably sucked up by taxes and legal fees, so there's nothing left over. There was some dispute over some of the assets held in the estate and who's going to get what, but by the time it all got settled, I mean, that's over 60 years, 66 years to settle this estate. Uh, there's not too many people alive to fight over the assets anymore. Now, the executor must file a terminal tax return within 6 months of the date of death if death occurred between November 1st and December 31st, or if by April 30th of the following year of death occurred between January 1st and October 31st. If there's income earned by the deceased prior to death, while still alive, but not yet received, it is possible to deal with the taxation of that income on what is called the rights and things return. Can be significant tax savings here, so a certified financial planner, a CFP professional, would know, have good knowledge about the rights and things return. Otherwise, one might utilize the services of a tax lawyer or a good estate lawyer or a good tax accountant to do these services. Can be somewhat complex, and what gets covered there. It's good tax advantage because you can reuse some of the deductions and credits that you did on the terminal return on the rights and things return, which is a significant tax advantage. Now, once the tax returns are filed and notice of assessment is provided, the executor applies for what's called a clearance certificate using Form TX19 filed with CRA. So that's the current form number, whether CRA changes that or not over the years. But there is a form, and you actually go to the CRA website, cra.gc.ca, and go to clearance certificate, and it brings up some lovely documents that explain exactly what process must be adhered to and who has to do what. You cannot distribute any assets. Nothing's allowed to be distributed until the clearance certificate is issued. The executor must keep a detailed account, and all transactions, expenses incurred, and funds distributed during the time the estate is being settled must be properly accounted for. Beneficiaries that are legal representatives can request a detailed summary of the handling of the estate, and any expenditures not accounted for can become the personal liability of the executor. So this is where the rubber starts to hit the road. Be careful that you're doing everything and keeping track of it, and nothing goes without being recorded. Reimbursement. Now, the executor can actually charge a fee, but limited. The percentages charged must be reasonable and are set by the courts in each province. They have a set fee that executors are allowed to charge, but if an executor felt that they were required to do significant effort, they could go and apply to the courts for additional fee or excess amounts. When using professionals such as accountants, lawyers, and appraisers, so we have some antiques, antique car collection or antique collection of some kind. We might want some qualified appraisers to come and give a proper value. You can pay those costs as long as the detailed accounting records are maintained. Other concerns. Estate holding income producing assets would require annual tax returns to be filed for each year until such time as the estate is settled. So not just a terminal return or a rights and things return, but the estate must file annual tax returns until all of the assets held in the estate are distributed to the intended beneficiaries. Life insurance advisors, MFDA reps, and securities advisors must be aware of their contractual and legal limitations when accepting the role of the executor. Could be significant conflict of interest issues, and some people say never, don't do it. Now, if it's a family member, you might be able to provide the executor services for a family member that had investment assets with you. But one has to be very cautious. I have a good friend who uh, 30 years plus in the insurance business, is a deacon in his in the church, and a very well respected man, has established a business providing executor services, and does quite well with it because of his respected roles. People look to him for advice. He is very cautious to never give investment advice for someone or the family of someone for whom he's performing executor services. Just doesn't want those conflicts of interest accusations or potential impact. Now, if you've been asked to serve as the executor, you can renounce the role. It could be advisable when there's a complex estate or impatient, unreasonable family members and beneficiaries. If there is no one who will accept the role of executor, the courts in each province will appoint someone to provide those services or perform those duties. As said at the onset, most people do not enjoy the process of being an executor slash executrix. Give careful consideration when accepting this responsibility, as it could lead to serious conflict of interest issues or allegations or concerns. A lot of people will assume that a son, a daughter, or other family member could perform this function. And the reason for that is they realize that, they got a son and two daughters, and we'll have the son be the executor, and he's not going to gouge his sisters. He's going to make sure they get their full value. So surely he won't charge for the service provided, and nobody ever thinks it's going to take that long. But it can be time consuming and daunting, and you need some special expertise. So now, the question to ask, if somebody says, I'm going to appoint my son as the executor, and lawyers ask this question, what makes them qualified to perform the role of executor? Do they have special skills? Are they good at detail? Are they good at following through on tasks? So those are good questions to ask, and people need to be asked those questions. So, I learned a long time ago that there's 3 conversations that we want to learn how to have with these elder clients that we have, perhaps, or people as they get older, is around the will, their wealth, and their health. And so if you have the ability to have those conversations, to ask your clients, do they have a will? And if they do, who is the executor of their will? And does the executor know that they're the executor? And is the executor qualified to perform those functions? Would the executor know where to locate the will? Would the executor know where to locate other pertinent information required to perform their duties? Pitfalls. Well, we know there are pitfalls, as I pointed out. I recently became aware through my LinkedIn, one of my LinkedIn groups that I belong to, where a couple of lawyers have shared court cases, 2 of them from Ontario that I'm aware of, where in one case the court stepped in because the executor was being disrespectful of the beneficiaries. They were asking questions, and the executor did not want to answer the questions and was treating people with a huge degree of disrespect, a lack of proper disclosure, and therefore was sanctioned by the courts and was forced to provide a detailed accounting and other issues. And then more scrutiny was provided by the courts in his or her future endeavors. The other one was where a beneficiary of the estate sued the estate and the executor because they didn't think they were being fairly treated. And the courts decided, in the end, that the court costs and the cost of pursuing the lawsuits, the litigation, were being borne by the litigants. So instead of coming out of the estate values, as typically happens, the litigants, the people that were proceeding with the litigation, were the ones that had to pay the court costs. So it might be a good idea to read do some search and look at some of the cases that you could find along the way, and read them, and perhaps keep that in the back of your mind when you're advising clients. People think that money is being saved by using non-professionals. Sometimes using amateurs and unqualified family members ends up costing more money. Money and wealth do strange things to people and can result in irrational thinking. So that completes this offering of our series of CE continuing education courses for our online services. We hope you enjoyed it and got some value out of this. It'll take you a few minutes now to proceed to do the following quiz. And in most jurisdictions, all online CE offerings must be accompanied with a quiz, at least a 10-question multiple choice exam, to prove that you've actually spent some time going through the course and you learned something to facilitate the need of providing online, ongoing continuing education for financial services professionals. Thank you, and we'll catch you next time.